Good morning, everyone. We're going to be taking notes today, so I'm going to give you a moment to get a piece of paper, and we'll set up notes with our topic and date like we have been. Your topic today is slavery in America, 1619 to 1865. Make sure when you set up the topic that you have, your heading with your name, the date, the class period you're in, and then you have the topic with the years here. We're going to talk about the institution of slavery as it's practiced in the New World. And an important thing that a lot of people overlook, because, of course, sometimes people don't have the best history education, is how actually long the institution of slavery lasted in the New World, and in particular in the United States. The first slaves came to the New World in 1619. The Civil War is fought and officially is going to end slavery in 1865. So that's about 250 years of slavery being practiced. It wasn't just practiced in the South, it was practiced all over the 13 colonies, but it slowly fades out in the North. And it's going to become an institution of the South, which is why eventually there's a war between the northern and southern states. If you notice that yellow part where it says segregation, just because slavery ends in 1865 does not mean that Black Americans are free and equal at that time. In 1865 and in the years after that, the South institutes a system called Jim Crow, which are segregation laws that kept the races separated in public facilities. And you can see the example there. There's a young man drinking from a water fountain that's marked colored. That was common in the South. They separated public facilities, schools, water fountains, anything you can imagine by race. The year 1954 is when they officially desegregated the schools, meaning that Black and white children went to school together. But it took more legislation in the 1960s to enforce those laws that were passed. So if you notice that the green part, that's kind of more in the lifetime of your parents and yourself. You were probably born in the year, I don't know, 2004 or 5, I have no idea, I think. And within your lifetime, of course, you've seen it just the past few months, the Black Lives Matter movement. That didn't just come out of nowhere. That came out of what you're looking at here, a system where for 300 years people were treated as second-class citizens and the results of that. So I like the caption on this that says it needs to be posted periodically to refresh people's memories, because it seems like every few years people forget that most of American history was like this, and it takes time to fix those issues. Slavery itself has always existed. Unfortunately, people are kind of horrible, and since the beginning of humanity, have enslaved other people for various reasons. People were captured in battle. If your family owed a debt, they could, sell you into slavery to pay that debt. Or in the case of the United States, being born to slave parents. The practice of slavery in the colonies is going to be especially sinister because it becomes generational, meaning that if your parents are slaves, you're most likely born a slave. And it becomes racial. It becomes an institution that Black Americans are held in almost exclusively. White slavery was not something practiced in the New World colonies by and large. So this becomes a racial and generational type of institution. And most cultures around the world have practiced slavery in one form or another. If you look at that bottom picture I have there, that's from the movie Gladiator. And the Roman gladiators themselves were slaves. They were captured in battle, forced to fight in these arenas. So they were enslaved people. Um, So just to kind of remind you, if your note taking is going more slowly than I'm talking, this is a screencastify, so you can pause and move and rewind and all that stuff. I'm going to move on. When slavery was practiced in the New World, slaves started to be imported from the African continent to the New World. And when I refer to the New World, I'm talking about North and South America, the United States, Mexico, South America of today, um, and in particular, the English colonies in the New World that you learned about in 8th grade. The portion of that journey referred to as the Middle Passage was especially brutal. And you can see the top picture is a slave ship, and I'm going to show you a closer diagram of that in a moment because it kind of reinforces how dehumanizing and kind of murderous this became. Slaves who were put onto these ships in Africa sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and would either end up in the northern English colonies or the southern Spanish colonies, and they were sold into slavery. The journey across the ocean was extremely brutal. People were shackled together. They didn't get a lot of food, they didn't get a lot of fresh air, and they were laying, as you can see, kind of very close to each other. So illness broke out very frequently. It was very common, unfortunately. About 18 million Africans were transported between 16 and 1800. The slave trade itself was outlawed in 1802, which is why the institution of slavery in the United States is going to become generational after that. They estimate about 3 million Africans died along the way, so this is considered to be a genocide, these couple of hundred years of the slave trade, because of the brutal way in which people were treated and the way in which they died. If you take a close look at this is a diagram that they made of how to efficiently pack people into a ship. And if you notice, there's, people crowded together, kind of stuffed into every spare area. So this became sort of a very brutal, dehumanizing way to ship people as if they are property or cargo. And it just leads to all kinds of evil. You can see here that these are smaller people. So, these are children. They're showing you how you can pack children onto a ship and sell them into slavery. So, obviously, extremely brutal practice and kind of chilling. This was all part of something called the Triangle Trade, and this is the way the economy worked for those few hundred years that slavery was practiced. Europe had colonies in the New World, and you can see the plantation states, the southern states here, would produce products like tobacco, cotton, and sugar. Those would be shipped to Europe. Europe would manufacture products out of those things. They would make clothes out of cotton, etc. They would sell those things in order to buy slaves from mostly the western part of Africa. This actually became known as the Slave Coast in the countries of Ghana, etc. And slaves would be sold here and shipped to the New World across that Middle Passage that we just talked about. And slaves would be sold to the Spanish colonies in South America or the Portuguese in Brazil. Here in the Middle Caribbean colonies, and then the plantation states, in particular the southern states of the United States, but it was actually practiced all over the English colonies for a long time. The first African slaves arrive in 1619. They are at first treated as indentured servants, meaning they're working on a contract. But once they abolish indentured servitude in the New World, slavery becomes a racial type of institution, meaning that Black Americans were the enslaved people. And it also becomes generational because in 1802, they're going to outlaw the slave trade, meaning you cannot import new slaves from Africa. So the way to get slaves after that is to, you know, for lack of a better term, breed them. That is how slave owners viewed these people. So you can see that at the bottom there's a couple of flyers. They're advertising slave auctions. They would sell people, and the way they sold them was extremely creepy because they would refer to them in terms like animals with their age and their conditions, and people would look at their teeth like you would for an animal. So this was extremely brutal and harsh. Um, you also remember, as you can see, there's a family that's standing here. They would allow children to stay with their parents or their mom at least up until the age of 6. So once you turn 6 years old, you could be sold away from your parents. People describe there's sources you'll hear about today that describe the mothers screaming as their children are taken away from them. So this is like a nightmare, obviously, for the people going through this. Particularly in the South, you had slave codes, which were meant to control slaves. White slave owners in the South constantly lived in fear of slave uprisings. So, of course, they outlawed slaves carrying guns. They did not allow slaves to learn to read. There was obviously racial laws about intermarriage and interaction between races, and this became part of the legacy of the South. Um, the penalties were extremely harsh. There were obviously, you can see down on the right hand side, that man's back has been scarred by a whip, which was a common punishment. That picture itself we're going to talk about later because that becomes kind of symbolic of the cruelty of slavery, and it's going to lead to people arguing slavery should be abolished. So very dehumanizing, treating people as if they're animals to be traded and sold. This also made children born to slaves automatic slaves. You could feasibly buy your way out of slavery. That did happen. It wasn't common, but it did happen. And people in the North who were born free were always free. So after a while, when slavery dies out in the North, it becomes an institution of the South. And we'll talk about why when we get to the Civil War. But this is how slaves' lives were governed for most of their lives. The picture you're looking at here was taken actually closer to the Civil War, just before the Civil War started, I believe. This man wandered into a Union Army camp, and they took this picture because of his extreme scars on his back. And these are scars from being whipped by an owner. And as people in the North start to turn against slavery, they use things like this as an example of the cruelty. You don't treat other human beings like this. Most people would not even treat an animal this way, of course. So this, and this is a photograph. So this shows you how long this went on. Photography was not common until the 1860s. So to get a photograph like this of someone who actually was a slave is scary and shows how long it lasted. Okay, finishing up. By the 1860s, slavery was gone in the northern states, and I'll show you, when we get to the Civil War about the geography involved in that. But it was still practiced and tolerated and encouraged in the southern states, and the fear was it would move west as the country grew to the west. So a lot of people especially in the northern states, start to turn against slavery, and those people are called abolitionists. That term abolition is the belief that slavery should be abolished, which means ended permanently or destroyed. And this is what's going to lead us directly to the conflict between the North and the South. The U.S. Civil War, which is going to start in 1861 and end in 1865. If you're in AP, we'll get to the Civil War later, but if you're in U.S. History, um, just regular U.S. History 11, we're going to be talking about this next week. You may go ahead and end the topic there. You can write end and today's date, which is either the 15th or 16th, whichever day you're actually listening to this. And you can go ahead and keep this topic together. And I'm going to go ahead and pause.